New York, Harlem, one of the most crime-ridden neighborhoods in the city. When the son of one of Bumpy Johnson's most trusted men is kidnapped, Bumpy is given a terrifying ultimatum. He has just 24 hours to kill a harmless Harlem doctor with his own hands. But where this demand will ultimately lead is something even Bumpy could never have predicted. Subscribe now so you don't lose the channel if you love stories about Harlem's legendary crime bosses. 1748. Harlem cools before it quiets. The neon isn't on yet. The heat hasn't left the concrete. Bumpy Johnson sat behind his desk, counting nothing, because the numbers were already right. A ledger doesn't lie if the man keeping it doesn't want it to. Wendell Grant stood across from him, ledger open, pencil behind his ear, going through the week's numbers one column at a time. Outside, a truck downshifted on 7th. Inside, only pencil on paper and the small sound of a man being careful. 1802. Wendell closed the book. Marcus has practice till 7. I told Percy I'd swing by after. Bumpy nodded once. A boy's schedule mattered to him the way a payment schedule mattered. Both were promises. Both had consequences if broken. Tell him to keep his left up. Wendell almost smiled. That was as close to affection as the office got. 20 years of partnership look like this. Not handshakes. Silence that doesn't need filling. 1811. You eating tonight? Or just moving papers around till you forget to? Bumpy didn't look up. I ate. When? Recently enough. Wendell shook his head, the way a man shakes his head at something he's stopped trying to fix. He gathered his coat off the rack, checked his own reflection once in the window glass, adjusted nothing. A man who doesn't need to adjust his reflection has made peace with how the world sees him. Bumpy envied that, some nights, without ever saying so. 1819. Time isn't numbers, it's alignment. Bumpy believed that the way other men believed in God or luck. A city runs on people arriving where they said they would. Break that, and something underneath starts to slip. He watched Wendell gather his coat, watched the door close behind him. Outside, a truck idled. A radio played from an open window 3 floors up. New York doesn't ask why. It asks how fast. 1833, Isaiah Cole came in with the evening's collections, laid the envelope on the desk without being asked, and waited the way a man waits who's learned patience pays better than questions. Bumpy counted it without touching most of it, just moving bills with one finger, reading the stack the way another man reads a face. Short. Delgado's short. Says his cousin's wedding ate the week. Weddings end. Debts don't. Isaiah nodded, already halfway to the door before the sentence finished. A good man learns to leave before he's told to. 1847. Bumpy stayed another hour, alone with receipts and a coffee gone lukewarm. He liked the hour after everyone left. It was the only hour that told the truth. No one performing for him, no one measuring their words against what he might do with them. Just numbers, and the small sounds of a building settling into night. A radiator ticking, a floor creaking 2 rooms over, nothing that needed his attention. He thought, briefly and without weight, of Mame at home, probably already asleep with a book still open on her chest. Some nights the ordinary was the only luxury a man like him could afford. 1912. Across the river of streets that made up Harlem's evening, Percy Owens stood in the gym doorway watching Marcus Grant wrap his hands. The boy was 17 and already had his father's habit of doing things carefully, like carelessness was a debt he refused to owe anyone. Left up, Percy said. Same words Bumpy would have said, though neither of them knew that yet. Marcus grinned. You sound like my old man. I sound like a man who doesn't want to see you on the canvas. The bag took 3 good hits before Marcus laughed at something Percy said, and for a moment, the evening was just an evening. 1926. Practice ended the way practice always ended. A towel, a joke, the gym owner flicking half the lights off to hurry the last stragglers out. Percy walked Marcus to the corner of Lenox, same as most nights. "You good from here?" "I'm 17, Percy, not 7. Humor an old man. You're 24. 24's old when you're doing what I do." Marcus laughed, shouldered his gym bag, and said he'd catch the bus, same as always. Percy watched him a few seconds longer than usual. He'd tell himself later it was instinct, though at the time it felt like nothing at all. 1934. A green Ford idled a block down the avenue, engine running, windows up despite the mild air. Percy clocked it the way a man clocks anything slightly wrong, a flicker of attention, gone almost as fast as it arrived. And then he turned back toward the gym to lock up. He would replay that flicker 100 times before the night was through. Some mistakes don't announce themselves. They wait in a man's memory until there's a reason to go looking for them. By the time Percy turned back around, the corner where Marcus had stood was already empty. 1941. The phone rang twice before Bumpy answered. Wendell's voice on the other end wasn't Wendell's voice. It was higher, faster, missing its floor.
"He's not here."
"Who?"
"Marcus, the gym. Percy said he never—"
Bumpy stood before the sentence finished. Some information doesn't need a whole shape to be understood. "Where are you?"
"The apartment. Bumpy, I need—"
"I'm coming." He hung up without saying goodbye. Goodbyes are for men who think there's time to spend on manners. 1947. He put on his coat the way other men load a gun. Quick, practiced, without looking down. He called Isaiah back before he'd even reached the stairwell, gave him 3 names and 3 corners, told him to start walking before he started asking why. Trouble? Not yet. Maybe. Move. Isaiah moved. That was the difference between men who lasted in Bumpy's world and men who didn't. The ones who understood that urgency explained itself later, if it explained itself at all. 1955. On the drive over, Bumpy made himself slow his thinking down, the way he'd trained himself to slow his hands down before a fight that mattered. Panic makes a man fast and stupid at the same time. He went over what he actually knew, which was almost nothing. A boy who hadn't come home. An hour that meant something only because a father had noticed it. Boys were late sometimes. Boys forgot to call. He told himself that twice, and believed it for exactly as long as it took to park the car outside Wendell's building. 2003. Wendell's apartment smelled like coffee left too long on the stove. He was standing in the middle of the room like a man who'd forgotten what rooms were for. On the table sat a plain envelope, no stamp, no name. Paper that arrives without a return address is never good news. Bumpy opened it slow. A photograph fell out first. Marcus, 17, wrists bound, eyes open, dry, scared in a way that hadn't found tears yet. Behind the photograph, one folded page. Bumpy read it twice, not because he didn't understand it the first time, because he wanted to be sure the world hadn't misheard itself. The note was short. Shortness is its own kind of threat. A man who needs paragraphs is still negotiating with himself. Kill the man in this photograph, by your own hand, by midnight tomorrow. Send proof, or the boy doesn't come home. A second photograph. An older man, gray coat, glasses. A face built for waiting rooms, not warrants. No name given, no reason given. Reasons are for men who expect forgiveness. Wendell grabbed the photograph out of his hands. "Who is he? Do you know him?" Bumpy studied the face. No. He looked at Wendell a moment longer than the answer required. "Do you?" Before Wendell could answer, Bumpy turned the envelope over in his hands, studying the paper itself the way he might study a man's shoes before trusting his face. Cheap stock, no watermark, typed, not handwritten, on a machine with a chipped letter E that struck slightly high on every line. A man who has access to a typewriter, but not a good one. A man careful enough to type instead of write, careless enough to use a machine that could someday be matched. Small things. Small things were often the only things that told the truth in a room full of people telling him what they thought he wanted to hear. 2023. Wendell's face did something quick. A flicker, gone before it finished. Never seen him in my life. Grief makes faces do strange things. Bumpy told himself that, and mostly believed it. Mostly. "Sit down." "I can't sit down. My son is—" Sitting doesn't mean stopping. It means thinking with your legs still. Wendell sat. His hands wouldn't stop moving, folding and unfolding the corner of the note. Bumpy watched those hands more than he watched Wendell's face. Faces lie easily. Hands take longer to learn how. For now, the hands only shook. That told him nothing yet. It would tell him something eventually. "Walk me through this morning," Bumpy said. "Everything. What he ate, what he said, who he saw." Wendell blinked like the question had come from somewhere far away. "Eggs. He was late for school, same as always. Said something about a test he hadn't studied for." "Anyone call the apartment? Anyone stop by?" "No. Nobody ever—" He stopped himself. "What?" "Nothing. A man came by the building last week asking about renting the empty unit downstairs. I didn't think—" "You weren't supposed to think. Not yet. Just remember. Describe him." Wendell tried and failed, and the failure sat between them like a third person in the room. Percy arrived within the hour, out of breath, gym bag still over his shoulder. He'd taught Marcus to jab before the boy could shave. That kind of teaching leaves debts that don't show up in any ledger. "I walked him to the corner myself. He said he'd catch the bus." "Who was on the street?" "Nobody I clocked." Cars, Percy thought. A green Ford, idled a block down. I didn't think. You weren't supposed to think. You were supposed to see. It came out harder than intended. Bumpy didn't apologize. Apology was a currency he spent rarely and never during a countdown. "Tell it again," Bumpy said. Slower. From the gym door. Percy told it again. The towel, the joke, the walk to the corner, the boy's laugh, the Ford idling with its windows up despite the mild air. How many in the car? Couldn't say. Windows were up, glare on the glass. Plate. Didn't think to look. Bumpy let the silence sit a beat before speaking, because silence taught men more than scolding ever did. Next time, look first. Think later. The order matters. Percy nodded, jaw tight, carrying the weight of a corner he hadn't watched closely enough and would carry for longer than one night. Harlem had a memory for cars that didn't belong. Bumpy sent Percy to walk the block again, slower this time, with better eyes. He sent Ruth Day a message through a boy on a bicycle, the kind of message that didn't use a phone. Paper again. Paper doesn't get tapped. Wendell paced the small apartment like a man measuring a cell he hadn't built yet. They said your hand, not mine. Why yours? Good question. The first good question of the night. Bumpy didn't have an answer. Not having an answer bothered him more than the deadline did. A threat that made sense was manageable. A threat that didn't was a door with no lock on either side. 2111. He split the search 3 ways before he left the apartment. Isaiah would take the blocks north of the gym. A man named Otis, who ran a newsstand 2 corners from the bus stop and saw more of the street than most policemen, would be asked directly, in person, the way a question deserves to be asked when it matters. Percy would walk the route twice more, this time with a flashlight and patience he didn't currently have. "And you?" Wendell asked. "I go where the fear points me first." He didn't say Rousseau's name yet. Saying a name out loud made it heavier than it had earned the right to be. 2118. Isaiah reported back within the half hour, breathless from moving fast without running, because running drew eyes, and eyes were the last thing they needed tonight. Nothing north. A woman on 132nd says she heard a car door, maybe 2, around the time we're talking about. Didn't see it, heard it. Where exactly? Half block from the bus stop, toward the avenue. Half a block was a direction. A direction was more than they'd had an hour ago. Bumpy filed it the way he filed everything that night, not as truth, but as a stone that might, eventually, fit somewhere in a wall he couldn't see the shape of yet. 2127. Otis at the newsstand remembered a green Ford, remembered it clearly, because he remembered most things clearly. It was the whole of his trade, watching a corner long enough that its rhythms became a kind of scripture. 2 men, didn't buy nothing, didn't read nothing, just sat. Faces. One had a hat pulled low. Other one, younger, had a mark here. Otis touched his own jaw, near the ear. Like a scar, maybe. Couldn't swear to it. A scar near the ear. Small. Not nothing. Bumpy thanked him with more money than the information was technically worth, because information that arrives freely tonight would need to arrive freely again tomorrow. 2135. He thought of Dominic Rousseau before he should have. That was the mistake, though he wouldn't see it as one for hours yet. 3 weeks earlier, at a table over the docks, Rousseau had lost a negotiation in front of 6 men who worked for him. Men don't forget rooms where they were made small. Bumpy had been the one who made the room. Grievances like that don't need a signature. He told Percy to find out where Rousseau was sleeping that week. He told himself it was investigation. It was closer to a guess wearing the coat of a conclusion. A man in a hurry mistakes speed for certainty more often than he'd like to admit. 2144. Before he left for Rousseau's part of town, Bumpy stopped at his own building, just long enough to look in on Mame, who was awake despite the hour, sitting up with the radio low and a cup of tea gone cold beside her. "You look like a man carrying something." "I am." "Tell me or don't, but sit first." He didn't sit. He couldn't, not tonight. Wendell's boy is missing. Her face changed the way a face changes when news becomes personal instead of general. "Then go," she said. "I'll be here when it's done." Some marriages are built on exactly that sentence, said plainly, without needing more. 2158. He drove east with Percy silent beside him, the city sliding past in its ordinary rhythms. A couple arguing on a stoop, a dog straining at a leash, a beat cop finishing his rounds without once looking their way. New York doesn't ask why, it asks how fast. Percy finally spoke somewhere around 116th Street. "You really think it's Rousseau?" "I think it's the loudest name in my head right now. That's not the same as the right one." "And why are we driving to see him?" "Because loud names have to be quieted before quiet ones can be heard." 2200. They parked 2 blocks from the social club Rousseau favored on nights he didn't want to be found easily, and Bumpy sat a moment studying the building before approaching it, counting the men on the door, counting the windows lit, counting the cars parked close enough to matter. A man who walks into a room without counting first is a man who's already decided the room can't hurt him. Bumpy had stopped believing any room was safe the moment that envelope hit the table. He told Percy to wait by the car, visible, unarmed looking, harmless as a man could make himself appear while still being neither. 2207 Russo's man answered the door of a social club on 118th with a toothpick and no patience. "Boss ain't seeing nobody tonight. He'll see me." Bumpy didn't raise his voice. Voices raised are voices that have already lost. He walked past the toothpick like the toothpick wasn't there. Russo sat at a back table with cards face down and a glass he hadn't touched. "Johnson, little late for company. Where's the boy?" Russo's face did the thing faces do when the question genuinely doesn't fit. Confusion, unrehearsed, is different from confusion performed. Bumpy had seen both. This looked like the first kind, but he wasn't ready yet to trust the difference. 2219. "What boy?" "Wendell Grant's son." Something moved behind Russo's eyes. Recognition of the name, not the crime.
"I got no interest in a bookkeeper's kid." "You had interest in a table 3 weeks back." Russo leaned forward. "A table's a table. A child's a different math." It should have landed as truth. Instead, it landed as a man defending a version of himself he wanted believed. Bumpy set both hands flat on the table. "If I find out different, you won't. If I do." Russo didn't answer that. Silence here isn't the absence of sound. It's a command. 2228. Bumpy didn't leave immediately. He asked, plainly, whether Russo would object to a look inside the warehouse the man kept near the river, the one everybody knew about and nobody mentioned, the one that moved more than fish through its doors most weeks. Russo's jaw tightened, calculation visible even through the offense he was performing. "You think I'd hide a child in my own ice house? I think a smart man hides things where nobody thinks to look because it's too obvious." Russo waved a hand, more tired than angry now. Look wherever you want tonight, Johnson. I got nothing to hide from a man chasing shadows." 2 of Bumpy's men, waiting outside, walked the warehouse floor within the hour. They found fish, nothing else. 2241. Outside, the street had gone thin. A few men on stoops, a radio somewhere playing something slow. Bumpy stood a moment, letting the night tell him what the room hadn't. Russo's fear had smelled real. Not innocent. Russo was never innocent. But real in the specific shape that mattered tonight. A man protecting a lie sweats one way. A man ambushed by a question sweats another. Bumpy had learned the difference the hard way, over years, over rooms just like that one. He didn't fully trust the lesson tonight. Fear made a man doubt his own instruments. That was the second thing the deadline had already stolen from him. Time. And now, certainty. 2250A. Numbers runner named Freddie. Small and fast and useful precisely because nobody paid him any mind. Caught up to Bumpy near the car with a piece of information he'd traded 3 favors to get. "Green Ford, matching your description. Gassed up on 145th about an hour after your boy went missing. Attendant remembers, on account of the men paid cash and didn't want a receipt." Description. 2 men. Attendant didn't get much more than that. Said one of them had an accent he couldn't place. Not local. Not local. That detail sat differently than the rest. Local grievances explain themselves. This one, increasingly, did not. 2303. Ruth Day found him on the corner of 125th, coat buttoned to the throat despite the mild air. She held nothing in her hands. Everything she carried lived behind her eyes. "The man in the photograph. I know him." Talk. "Dr. Elijah Rourke runs a small practice on 132nd. Delivers babies, sets bones, writes death certificates when the county doesn't want to bother." Enemies. None that I've heard sung about. Debts. Clean as a church floor. That should have been relief. It wasn't. A man with no enemies and no debts is a strange thing to order killed. Somebody wanted something from his death that had nothing to do with him. That kind of want is the coldest kind there is. 23:14. Ruth gave him more, unasked, because she understood better than most that a man in a hurry doesn't always know which question to ask next. "Rourke delivered half this neighborhood, Bumpy. Delivered you men working for you right now. Delivered Marcus, if I remember the year right." That landed harder than she probably intended. The man they'd been sent to kill had likely held Wendell's son in his hands the day he was born. "You ever hear anything about him and money? Old debts, old favors? Anybody he crossed decades back?" Nothing sung, but sung and true aren't always the same thing. She was right, and it was the kind of right that offered no comfort at all. 23:24. Clean as a church floor kept repeating itself in Bumpy's head the whole walk to the car. Understanding always comes late. That's why it's expensive. He thought of Wendell's hands, the flicker on his face, the too fast answer. He set the thought down the way you set down a hot dish, quickly, without deciding yet where it belongs. A grieving father's face does strange things. He'd said that once tonight already. Repeating a fact to yourself is sometimes reassurance. Sometimes it's a warning you're refusing to hear the first time. 23:32. Before Rourke, he stopped at the bus stop on Lenox where Marcus had last stood. Nothing marked it as a place where a life had bent sideways. No chalk, no crowd, just a bench and a lamppost, and a city that had already forgotten what happened there hours ago. He crouched near the curb anyway, the way a man checks a door he already knows is locked, because checking costs nothing, and certainty is worth the trouble of confirming twice. A gum wrapper. A cigarette butt. Foreign brand, not sold on this corner as far as he knew. Small things. Small things were often the only things that told the truth. 23:41 Otis, still at his stand though the hour had grown late, added one more detail he'd forgotten to mention the first time. The way memory sometimes releases things slowly, like a fist unclenching. That younger one, the one with the mark near his ear, he had a ring. Big one. Gold, maybe. Caught the streetlight when he lit a cigarette. A ring. A scar. An accent that didn't belong to Harlem. None of it was a name. All of it was a shape, slowly, painfully becoming visible in the dark, the way a photograph becomes visible in a developing tray. Not all at once, but line by line, until a face finally looks back. 23:52. Roark's practice sat dark, blinds drawn, a single light burning behind frosted glass on the second floor. Bumpy knocked twice, the second knock softer than the first. Soft is just wrapping for a blade. The door opened on a chain. An old man's eye found him through the gap. "Whatever you're selling, I don't need it tonight." "I'm not selling." "Then whatever you're collecting." "I'm asking." The chain stayed on. "Someone's paying you to kill me. Say it plain if that's why you're here." The directness surprised Bumpy more than it should have. A man who names his own death out loud has already been living inside the fear for hours, maybe days. "Somebody wants you dead.
Not me, but my hand's the one they asked for. The chain slid off slowly, the sound of it louder than it should have been in the empty hallway. Roark let him in without another word. Inside, the office smelled of antiseptic and old paper.
Files stacked floor to ceiling, decades of Harlem's births and deaths, kept in one man's careful hand. "Sit," Roark said, though he didn't sit himself. "You know who sent this." "I have a guess. I won't say it. Not yet." "Why not?" The old man's eyes were tired in a way sleep wouldn't fix. "Because guesses said out loud become accusations, and accusations get people killed faster than silence does." 018. Bumpy studied the room while Roark stood at the window, blinds parted a hair, watching the street the way a man watches for something he expects and dreads in equal measure. "You've been afraid before tonight." "I've been afraid for longer than tonight." "How long?" Roark didn't answer directly. "Long enough that I stopped expecting it to end on its own. I thought it would come as a letter to the police or a knock from a lawyer. Not this." "Not a boy." "No," Roark said, quieter. "Not a boy. That part I didn't see coming, and it sits worse than the rest." 027. Bumpy studied him. A man protecting a name the way other men protected money. "You're not afraid of me. I'm afraid of everything tonight. You're just standing closest to it." That was, Bumpy thought, the most honest sentence he'd heard since the envelope hit the table. "I need a reason someone wants you gone." Roark's hand drifted, unconsciously, toward a locked drawer in his desk. He caught himself, pulled the hand back. Small gestures carry more weight than speeches if you know how to read them. Bumpy noted the drawer the way a man notes a door he intends to open later, when there's time to open it properly. Tonight, there wasn't time for anything properly. 034. "That drawer," Bumpy said. Roark's face closed like a shop at the end of a long day. "Old files, nothing that concerns tonight." "Everything concerns tonight. That's what tonight is." "You have 20 hours to save a boy, Mr. Johnson. Spend them chasing my filing cabinet if you want. I won't stop you. But it won't get you closer to him." It was, Bumpy noted, a very specific kind of denial. Not a lie, exactly. More a redirection. The kind a man uses when the truth is real, but not yet useful to share. He let the drawer go. For now. "A boy's life is running out on a clock I don't control," Bumpy said. "I'll ask you once more, plain. Give me a name." Roark shook his head, slow, final. "Ask Wendell Grant about his wife." The sentence landed strange, sideways, a door opening onto a hallway Bumpy hadn't known was in the house. "Corinne's been dead 8 years. I know exactly how long she's been dead." Roark said nothing else. Understanding always comes late. That's why it's expensive. Bumpy left the office with more questions than he'd walked in carrying, which was its own kind of failure. A night that ends with more unknowns than it started with is a night that's losing. 049. On the stairs down from Roark's office, Bumpy stopped, one hand on the rail, and made himself sit with the sentence a moment longer than comfort allowed. Ask Wendell about his wife. Not a name, not an accusation, a door left ajar by a man too frightened to push it open himself. He thought of every year he'd known Wendell, the weddings, the funerals, the quiet Sundays, and could not for the life of him remember a single detail about how Corinne Grant had actually died, beyond the fact that she had, and that grief had followed the way grief always follows, predictably, without inviting scrutiny. 0:55. Outside, the street had emptied further, and a car he didn't recognize sat parked half a block down with its lights off, engine running just enough to keep the windows from fogging. Not the green Ford. Different make, same wrongness. Bumpy didn't approach it directly.
He walked the opposite way first, circled the block, came at it from behind. An old habit, useful more often than a man liked to admit. By the time he reached where it had been, it was gone. Somebody was watching Rourke's building, or watching him. Neither possibility improved the night. 102 Percy caught up with him 2 blocks later, having peeled off from his own patrol to check in, and together they retraced the car's likely path with no real hope of finding it. City streets swallowed cars the way rivers swallowed stones, without ceremony, without a trace worth following in the dark. You get anything from the doctor? A door I didn't expect. Nothing behind it I can use yet. What kind of door? Bumpy didn't answer right away. The kind you don't walk through until you're sure you want to see what's on the other side. 1:15. He sat in the car outside Rourke's building a long while before starting the engine. The city kept moving around him regardless. A bus wheezing past, a couple arguing softly on a stoop, a dog barking at nothing in particular. Harlem doesn't pause for one man's arithmetic. Bumpy turned the sentence over. Ask Wendell about his wife. Corinne Grant, quiet woman, died in her sleep, the certificate said. Heart, the certificate said. He hadn't questioned it then. No one had. Grief doesn't invite questions. It discourages them, politely, the way a locked door discourages a stranger without needing a sign. He thought of Wendell's hands again, folding the note's corner. The thought didn't leave this time. 1:26. His car radio, tuned low to a frequency Isaiah monitored on nights like this, crackled with a voice trying to sound calmer than it was. Boss, got something on the Ford. Attendant on 145th remembered a partial plate. Not enough to run clean, but it narrows the burrow. Read it. Isaiah read 3 characters and a guess at a 4th. Not enough. Almost enough. The difference between those 2 things had cost men their lives before, in Bumpy's experience, and saved them just as often. Keep pulling the thread, he said, and meant it as much for himself as for Isaiah. Back at the apartment, Wendell hadn't slept, hadn't sat, hadn't stopped pacing the same 6 feet of floor. Anything? Doctor doesn't know why he's a target. It was, technically, true. Bumpy watched Wendell's face for the lie he half expected and didn't fully find. Grief, or something wearing its clothes convincingly. 22 hours, Wendell said, more to himself than to Bumpy. 22 hours and they kill my boy over a doctor who delivers babies. Nobody's killing anybody yet. You have a plan. Bumpy didn't, not really. Only the shape where a plan would eventually have to go. I have a night left to build one. 1:47. Tell me about Corinne, Bumpy said, careful to make it sound like nothing more than a tired man's wandering thought, not the deliberate blade it actually was. Wendell froze mid-step. Why? Because Rourke said her name, not yours, hers. Something crossed Wendell's face. Grief, certainly. But underneath it, moving fast, something closer to fear than sorrow. She died of a bad heart, Bumpy. You know that. Everybody knows that. I know the certificate says that. What are you saying? I'm not saying anything yet. I'm asking why a man about to be killed on my orders brought up your wife's name instead of his own defense. 1:52. Wendell sat down hard, like the strength required to keep pacing had run out all at once. He delivered Marcus. He treated Corinne for years before she passed. Of course he'd say her name. She's the connection between us. That's all it is. It was a reasonable answer. Reasonable answers, Bumpy had learned, were sometimes the truth and sometimes the truth's very careful cousin. Then you won't mind me asking around, old neighbors, anybody who remembers that week. Ask whoever you want, Wendell said, too fast, and then slower, softer, like a man catching himself. Just find my son first, please. The please undid some of the suspicion, not all of it. He left Wendell with instructions to sit, to wait, to touch nothing, to call no one. Instructions a grieving father would resent and, resenting them, might not follow. Bumpy noted that too, filed it beside the flicker and the folded corner and the drawer Rourke's hand had reached for and stopped. None of it was proof. All of it was weight. Outside, the sky hadn't decided yet whether it belonged to night or morning. Percy waited by the car, jaw tight, still carrying the guilt of a corner he hadn't watched closely enough. What now?
Now we count what we actually know, Bumpy said, instead of what scares us into guessing. Counting is how people soothe fear. He needed soothing less than he needed the truth. They pulled the car over on a quiet stretch of 7th, and on the back of an old delivery manifest, Bumpy wrote it all down the way he'd been taught to write down a ledger that didn't balance. Not to solve it that instant, but to see its shape clearly enough to know where the error most likely lived. A green Ford, a man with a scar and a ring, an accent not local, a doctor with no enemies, ordered dead by strangers, a drawer Rourke wouldn't open, a wife 8 years buried, suddenly relevant, and Wendell at the center of all of it, either the most wronged man in Harlem or something else entirely. They drove without talking for 6 blocks. Then Bumpy spoke, mostly to hear the shape of it outside his own head. Russo scared the wrong way to be lying. Rourke's scared, and he's protecting somebody, not himself. And Wendell... He didn't finish the sentence. Some sentences are safer left half-built, at least until you're sure of the foundation. Percy glanced over, waiting. Bumpy said nothing more. The city passed by in its familiar order. Shuttered bodegas, a lit diner, a beat cop finishing his rounds without once looking their way. New York doesn't ask why. It asks how fast. 21 hours remained, and Bumpy Johnson had, for the first time that night, more questions about his own house than about anyone else's. 2:22. A boy on a bicycle found them near the diner, breathless, holding a second envelope that had been left, he said, on the newsstand counter, with instructions to find the tall man in the gray coat, quick. This one was thinner. Inside, no photograph this time, only a line of type from the same chipped E machine. The clock moved up. Noon, not midnight. 12 hours, not 22. Someone was watching them work and had decided the work was moving too well for comfort. That, more than the threat itself, told Bumpy something important. The deadline wasn't fixed. It was a leash, and somebody's hand was on the other end of it, tightening whenever they pleased. 2:31. Percy read the note over his shoulder and swore under his breath. The first time he'd broken his composure all night. They're watching us. Has to be. Or someone told them how close we're getting. The sentence hung there, ugly, unavoidable. If someone had told them, it meant someone in the small circle who knew about Russo, about Rourke, about the pace of the search itself, had a line running somewhere Bumpy couldn't see.
That circle was small enough to count on one hand. Wendell was on that hand. Bumpy didn't say it aloud. Not yet. Saying it aloud would make it a fact he'd have to act on. And he wasn't ready to act on a suspicion this size without more than a folded corner and a flicker of a face.
2:40. He dropped Percy at the corner with instructions to sleep 2 hours, no more, and to be sharp by sunrise. Alone in the car, Bumpy allowed himself something close to stillness. He thought about Corinne Grant, a woman he'd known for over a decade and had, if he was honest, never truly looked at. She'd been the wife of his right hand, present, warm, unremarkable in the specific way that made a person easy to overlook. He tried to remember the exact week she'd died. He couldn't. That failure bothered him more than the deadline. A man who forgets the death of someone close has let something important go unguarded. He drove home without deciding what that meant yet. 2:58. His own house was dark, his own wife asleep, and Bumpy stood a moment in the doorway of his bedroom without entering it. Some nights you don't deserve the rest a bed offers. He went instead to his study, pulled out an old file drawer, and found what little paper existed on Corinne Grant's death.
A death certificate, copied years ago out of habit more than suspicion. Heart failure, natural causes. Signed by Dr. Elijah Rourke. Bumpy sat with that fact a long time, turning it slowly, looking for its edges. Paper is colder than steel. It also, sometimes, cuts just as deep. He didn't sleep that night. He placed a call, quiet and careful, to a man named Kessler who spent his working hours examining signatures for banks that didn't like being lied to. Kessler didn't ask why a man called him at 3 a.m. about an 8-year-old certificate. Men in his line of work learned early which questions shortened their careers. "Bring it by first light," Kessler said. "I'll tell you what the ink tells me. No promises beyond that." It wasn't much. It was, at least, a door that hadn't been there an hour earlier. One more thread pulled loose from a night that had started with almost nothing to hold on to at all. 3:24. Between calls, Bumpy allowed himself, briefly, the shape of a memory he hadn't visited in years. Corinne Grant at a Christmas gathering, laughing at something Mame had said. A woman who existed in his mind mostly as background, as furniture in the rooms of his own life. He tried to recall if Wendell had seemed different after, quieter maybe, harder working, if that was possible for a man already relentless. Grief does that to some men, sharpens them, gives them somewhere to put the hours they no longer knew what to do with. Or it hides something behind exactly that same sharpening, exactly that same industry. He couldn't yet tell which he was remembering. 3:40. By the time the sky started turning gray at the edges, Bumpy Johnson had built no accusation, only a shape where one might eventually stand. Wendell's hands, Rourke's silence, a signature on a certificate that had never once been questioned. None of it proved anything. All of it pointed somewhere he didn't want to look yet. He thought of the boy in the photograph, wrists bound, eyes dry. 12 hours left on a clock somebody else had built and handed to him without asking if he wanted to hold it. He put the certificate back in the drawer, locked it, and sat with his coat still on. 3:52. Isaiah called again, this time with something closer to a face than the night had offered yet. A junk dealer near the river remembered renting storage space, cash only, no name given beyond Carmine, to 2 men matching the general description they'd assembled, one with a scar, one older, quieter, doing most of the talking. Not Rousseau's men. Rousseau's men were known, catalogued, familiar faces in familiar places. These were new. Rented and paid and gone within the same week, the dealer said, like men who understood exactly how long they intended to need the space and not a day longer.
403 Carmine wasn't a real name, Bumpy was fairly certain. Too plain, too easy, the kind of name a careful man gives when he expects to be asked and wants the answer to mean nothing. But it was a thread, and threads, pulled long enough in the right direction, eventually led somewhere solid. He told Isaiah to find the storage unit, to look without touching, to report back before doing anything else. And if the boy's there, then you call me before you do anything brave. Isaiah didn't argue. He understood, better than most, the difference between courage and patience, and which one tonight actually required. 4:17. Bumpy drove to the river himself, unable to sit still in the study any longer, the 12 hours pressing on him now in a way the original 22 never quite had. The storage yard sat quiet under a single sodium lamp, rows of corrugated doors identical enough to blur together in the dark. Isaiah met him at the gate, shook his head before Bumpy had even asked.
Empty. Whatever was here, it's gone. Recent, though. Dust's disturbed, and there's a smell. Diesel, maybe, or something like it. Recent. Gone. The men who'd rented it under a false name had moved on ahead of them, which meant they were being careful, organized, patient. None of those qualities belonged to men working for money alone. 4:31. Standing in the empty unit, Bumpy crouched and ran a hand along the concrete floor, feeling for anything the eye might miss in bad light. A groove, a stain, a shape pressed into dust that told a story words couldn't. Near the back wall, faint, he found 4 small indentations, evenly spaced, the kind a folding cot leaves behind when it's stood on the same spot long enough. A cot meant someone had planned to keep a person here more than briefly. It also meant, more troublingly, that plan had changed. The boy moved somewhere else, for reasons that could be as simple as caution or as ugly as impatience. 4:44. They knew we'd get here eventually, Isaiah said, standing in the doorway. They knew someone would get here, maybe not us, maybe not tonight. Either way, they moved him before we could. Bumpy stood, dusted his hands, and looked out at the gray beginning to bleed into the eastern sky over the water. Or they never intended to keep him here past today at all. A place like this isn't for holding a person long. It's for holding them quiet for a short while in between 2 other places. Which meant there was a place before this one and a place after. Neither had a name yet. 5:02. Dawn was arriving the way it always arrived in Harlem, indifferent to whatever the night had cost the people beneath it. A milk truck rattled 2 streets over. Somewhere, a church bell rang the wrong hour. Early by habit or by a clock nobody had bothered to fix. Ordinary Harlem was waking up to an ordinary Tuesday, unaware that somewhere within it, a boy sat bound in a room nobody yet had a name for, and a clock somebody else controlled was sliding toward noon. Bumpy stood at the river's edge a moment, letting the cold air do what coffee couldn't anymore. Understanding always comes late. That's why it's expensive. 5:15. He met Percy back at the car, the 2 hours of sleep Bumpy had ordered clearly not taken, judging by the redness in the younger man's eyes. You were supposed to rest. Couldn't. Kept thinking about the corner. Thinking doesn't bring him back faster. No, Percy said, but stopping feels worse. Bumpy understood that better than he let on. He laid out the morning's plan in short, clipped instructions. Kessler and the certificate first, then back to Rourke with harder questions, then, finally, the conversation with Wendell that neither of them wanted to have, but both knew was coming. Sooner now than either had hoped.
5:31. Before leaving the riverside, Bumpy allowed himself one more look at the empty storage unit, its door still hanging open on a life that had passed through it briefly and left almost nothing behind. A cot, a smell of diesel, a name that wasn't a name. He thought of the note's second version, the moved deadline, and understood now, more clearly than before, that whoever had written it wasn't simply cruel. They were organized enough to move a hostage between locations without leaving a trail any ordinary man could follow, and careful enough to shorten a clock the moment they sensed the search closing in. That kind of care came from experience, not rage. 5:47. Kessler's office smelled of dust and ink, and the old man examined the 8-year-old certificate under a jeweler's loupe for longer than Bumpy's patience wanted to allow, though he said nothing, because rushing a careful man rarely made him faster. Finally, Kessler set the loupe down. "Signature's Rourke's. No question there. But look here." He tapped a corner of the page. "The date's been altered. Small thing, a 1 made into a 7 or close to it. Skilled hand, not obvious unless you're looking for it." Meaning? Meaning this certificate was filed later than it claims to have been. The room went very quiet. "How much later?" "Hard to say exactly. Weeks, maybe longer, judging by how the ink's aged against the paper stock. This wasn't signed the day it says it was signed. A death certificate, backdated. A doctor too frightened to explain a locked drawer. A wife nobody had questioned in 8 years, because grief doesn't invite questions, and a careful man had understood that better than anyone." Bumpy thanked Kessler, paid him more than the morning's work required, and walked out into a Harlem fully awake now, carrying a piece of paper that had just turned from a formality into a wound nobody had known was still open. 6:02. Sunlight caught the note still sitting on Wendell's kitchen table when Bumpy returned. The second envelope beside it, both of them ordinary paper doing extraordinary damage simply by existing. He hadn't decided yet what he believed. Certainty required more than a bent date and a flinch and a name spoken by a frightened old man. But the shape was there now, undeniable even to a man who badly wanted it not to be. Wendell Grant's grief was real. Whether it was the whole truth or only the truth's careful, well-dressed cousin was a question Bumpy Johnson would spend the coming hours finding out, with a clock running toward noon and a boy's life sitting somewhere in the balance of the answer. 6:14. Wendell hadn't moved from the kitchen chair since sunrise, the 2 envelopes still on the table like evidence at a trial nobody had called yet. Bumpy set the doctored certificate down beside them. "Kessler says this date was changed, weeks after it claims to be signed." Wendell stared at it a long moment before looking up. "That's Rourke's error, not mine." "Maybe." "You think I altered my own wife's death certificate?" Bumpy didn't answer that directly. A question left open sometimes does more work than one closed too soon. 6:23. "I think somebody wanted a version of that week written down that wasn't the true one," Bumpy said. "I don't know yet whose hand did the writing." Wendell's jaw worked, the way a man's jaw works when he's deciding whether anger or grief will carry the next sentence. "You've known me 20 years. "I've known your ledgers 20 years. A man's numbers and a man's heart don't always share an office." It was cruel, and Bumpy knew it was cruel. And he said it anyway, because 6 hours remained to noon, and cruelty sometimes moved faster than patience. 6:31. Percy came back through the door with coffee nobody had asked for, sensing correctly that the room needed something to do with its hands. "Storage yards confirmed empty. Nothing else found." The scarred one. The ring. Nothing new since last night. Bumpy took the coffee, didn't drink it, set it on the windowsill where it would sit forgetting its own purpose the way most things in that apartment had that morning. Then we go back to Rourke. Harder this time. A door left ajar isn't the same as a door open. 6:47. Rourke answered before the second knock, as if he'd been standing behind the door, waiting for exactly this visit and no other. You look like a man who didn't sleep. Neither did you. I'm old. Sleep and I have an understanding that doesn't require agreement most nights.
Bumpy stepped inside without invitation this time. The certificate's date was changed, after the fact. You want to tell me who asked you to change it, or should I start guessing out loud the way you told me not to? Rourke's shoulders dropped, some tension leaving a body that had clearly been holding it a long while. If I tell you, and I'm wrong about who's listening, more people die than the ones already in danger. More people are already about to die than you think, Doctor. 12 hours from now, unless the shape changes. The old man walked to the window, parted the blinds a hair, the same habit as the night before. A man checking for eyes that might be checking for him. Sit. I'll tell you what I can. Not all of it. What I can. 8 years ago, Corinne Grant came to my office. Not sick. Frightened. Bumpy said nothing. Let the silence do the pulling. She'd found something in Wendell's books. Money that moved and came back different than it left.
She didn't understand accounting. Not really. But she understood enough to know it wasn't right. She told you this. She told me because she trusted me, and because she didn't know who else in this neighborhood wasn't already loyal to her husband before her. That sentence alone reorganized 8 years of Bumpy's memory in the space of a breath. 7-11. She was going to tell you, Rourke said. Not the police. You. She thought you'd want to know before it became a problem you couldn't fix quietly. When? She never got the chance. 2 weeks after she came to me, she was dead. Officially, her heart. I signed that certificate myself, and at the time, I believed every word of it. And now? Rourke's hands, folded on the desk, tightened until the knuckles went pale. Now I've had 8 years to notice things I didn't let myself notice then. 7:19. What things? The bruising on her arm, faint, that I wrote off as a fall. The timing, 2 weeks, almost to the day after she came to me.
The way Wendell insisted on a closed casket, small service, quick burial, no questions from anyone who might have asked them. Bumpy sat very still. A man learns, in his line of work, that stillness is sometimes the only honest response a body has left. You're telling me you think he killed her? I'm telling you I've spent 8 years telling myself I don't think that. I'm running out of years. 7:27. Why speak now? Why not 8 years ago, or last month, or any day between? Because last week, I decided I couldn't carry it any further. I wrote a letter. I was going to take it to the district attorney's office, not you. I didn't think you'd believe me over a man you trusted with your money for 2 decades. When was the letter written? 9 days ago. 9 days. The kidnapping had come 4 days after that. Timing, again, doing more talking than words ever managed to. 7:35. Who did you tell about the letter? No one. I hadn't sent it yet. I was still deciding, still afraid, still an old man arguing with himself in an empty office at night. Then how did whoever sent that photograph know to target you at all? Rourke had no answer for that, and the absence of an answer sat in the room heavier than any answer could have. Somebody had known about a letter that had never left this building, which meant somebody close enough to Rourke's fear had been close enough to hear it, unspoken. 7:44. Bumpy left the practice with a name he didn't yet have and a shape that was tightening around one he wished he didn't. Percy waited outside,
reading the change in Bumpy's face before a single word was spoken. Bad. Complicated. Complicated is worse than bad most mornings. You think Wendell's boy really is out there because of something Wendell did. I think a boy is tied up somewhere because his father may have killed his mother 8 years ago, and somebody's decided that debt is finally due. That's not a thought a man carries easily. They drove in silence toward the office, the morning traffic thickening the way Harlem's traffic always thickened once the night's business gave way to the day's. Bumpy watched the storefronts without really seeing them, his mind running the timeline again and again, the way a man runs a thumb along a blade to test its edge. 9 days since the letter was written, 4 days since it hadn't been sent yet. Sometime in between, someone had learned enough to build a kidnapping around a threat that hadn't even reached the mail. Isaiah met them at the office door, a folder under his arm, and the particular urgency of a man who'd found something and wasn't sure yet if it was good news or bad. The storage unit. I went back at first light, walked it again in better sun. And found a receipt, wedged under the door track, must have fallen out of somebody's pocket. Delivery company. Paid the rental in cash, but the delivery slip's got an account number on it. An account number. The first hard, physical thread of the entire night. Whose account? Can't tell from the slip alone. Numbers only, no name. But it's a business account, not personal. The format matches how banks code commercial ledgers. Bumpy took the slip, turned it over, studied the ink the way Kessler had studied the certificate. Take it to Kessler. He'll know which bank uses this format, even if the number alone won't give up a name. Isaiah nodded, already moving, and Bumpy watched him go with the small, tired satisfaction of a man who'd finally been handed something solid to hold. Wendell. Wendell arrived at the office not long after, having been unable to stay in the apartment any longer, the walls of it apparently having become a kind of accusation on their own. Any word? A lead, nothing confirmed. What kind of lead? Bumpy studied him before answering, watching for the flicker, the folded corner, the too fast breath. A receipt from the storage unit, an account number. We're chasing it. Wendell's face did nothing unusual this time. Only tired, only afraid, only a father counting hours the way other men counted money. That, too, told Bumpy nothing certain. 8:35. I want to help, Wendell said. Sitting here is killing me faster than the clock is. Then help. Tell me about the money Corrine found. The silence that followed lasted long enough to become its own answer. How do you know about that? Rourke told me what he could. Not everything. Enough. Wendell sat down slowly, the fight going out of him in stages, like a tide pulling back from a shore it had held only a moment. That's 8 years old, Bumpy. It has nothing to do with Marcus. Then explain it to me anyway. We have time for the truth, if nothing else. 8:47. There was money, Wendell said, finally, quietly. A gap in the books, small at first, that I closed myself before you ever saw it. I told myself it was a mistake I was fixing, not a theft I was hiding. How much? Over 3 years, maybe 12,000. I paid it back, every cent, eventually, before you'd have noticed a thing missing. Corinne found it before you finished paying it back. Yes. And then she died. Wendell's eyes came up sharp, wounded, furious in a way that looked, finally, entirely unrehearsed. I did not kill my wife. Then who did? Nobody killed her. She had a bad heart. It ran in her family. Her mother died the same way at 51. Rourke says there was bruising on her arm. Says the burial was rushed. Says you insisted on a closed casket. Because I couldn't stand to look at her, Bumpy. Because grief does not always look like a man behaving reasonably. The outburst filled the small office,
and then drained out of it just as fast, leaving Wendell hollow, breathing hard. A man who had either told the truth completely or lied better than any liar Bumpy had faced in years. Bumpy let the silence sit before speaking again, giving both of them room to find their footing. "I'm not accusing you of anything yet. I'm telling you what pieces are on the table. Because pieces on a table sometimes arrange themselves into a shape neither man wants to see. And if they arrange into me, then we'll deal with that after your son is home, not before. I gave you my word about that much, and I intend to keep it, whatever else turns out true." Wendell nodded, and for the first time all morning, something like relief crossed his face. Bumpy noted that too.
9:15. Isaiah returned from Kessler's with the account traced. A shell company, Larkspur Holdings, registered 2 years prior, address a mail drop on 34th Street that existed to receive letters and nothing else. 2 years old. That's before Corinne, well after her, depending how you count it. Doesn't tell us who's behind it. Directors. One name on file. A lawyer who files papers for a fee and asks no questions. Dead end unless we lean on him directly. Then we lean. Bumpy checked the clock on the office wall. 2 hours and 45 minutes until noon. 9:31. The lawyer, a thin, nervous man named Ostrander, who kept an office above a shoe repair shop on 34th, folded almost immediately under the particular weight of Bumpy Johnson standing in his doorway without an appointment. "I file paperwork. I don't ask who's behind the paperwork. That's the whole of my business model, Mr. Johnson, and it's kept me alive this long. Today it might not."
Ostrander's hands shook as he pulled a drawer, produced a slim folder. The retainer came through a courier, cash. No face I'd remember. I can give you the courier service's name. That's all I have. 9:44. The courier service, when Bumpy's men reached it 20 minutes later, kept records the way most legitimate businesses kept records. Carefully, boringly, without any sense that they might someday matter to a man counting down toward noon. The pickup address for Larkspur's retainer 2 years back was an apartment building on 128th Street. Bumpy knew the building. He'd walked past it 100 times without once considering what it held. 2 units up from street level, 3rd floor, a modest place a bookkeeper might reasonably afford on an honest salary, or use to hide a dishonest one. 9:58. He didn't tell Wendell where he was going. Percy drove, silent, understanding without being told that whatever waited at 128th Street was a door neither of them wanted to walk through carrying assumptions. The building's super, an old woman with keys on a ring the size of a fist, remembered the tenant from 2 years back. Quiet man, paid on time, moved out abruptly after less than a year. "Name?" Bumpy asked. She squinted at a ledger of her own, the kind every building kept, the kind nobody thought to burn. "Grant," she said. "W. Grant." The word landed the way a verdict lands. Not a surprise exactly, more a confirmation of something already half believed, arriving anyway with its own particular weight. "You're certain?" "I don't forget a tenant who paid on time. Wish I could say the same for the rest of them." Percy said nothing, watching Bumpy's face for a reaction that didn't come, because 20 years of practice had taught him to hold his face still, even when the ground underneath him had just shifted considerably. "Thank you," Bumpy said, and walked back to the car like a man carrying something heavy and refusing to let it show in his gait. 10:19. In the car, he sat a long moment before starting the engine. Understanding always comes late. That's why it's expensive. Wendell had rented a shell company's mail drop under his own initials, in a building blocks from his own home, 2 years after his wife's death, and had never once mentioned it in 20 years of otherwise total transparency about every dollar that moved through Bumpy's operation. It didn't prove murder. It proved a lie, carefully maintained, and a lie maintained that carefully usually had something worse underneath it than money. 10:31. "You think he did it," Percy said, finally, unable to hold the question any longer.
I think he's been lying to me about something for 2 years, maybe longer. That doesn't make him a murderer. It makes him a man with a room in his life I've never been allowed to enter. What do we do? We keep looking for the boy. That doesn't change, whatever Wendell turns out to be. And we watch him, close, without him knowing we're watching. 90 minutes to noon. The clock, as always, didn't care what anyone had just learned. 10:38. Back at the office, Wendell was on the phone when they arrived, voice low, urgent, the receiver pressed tight enough to his ear that his knuckles had gone pale around it. He hung up fast when Bumpy entered. "Who was that?" "Nobody. Ruth Day, checking in." Bumpy hadn't spoken to Ruth in 3 hours. He knew, immediately and with total certainty, that the lie had just been told badly, carelessly, by a man too exhausted to construct a better one. He said nothing about it yet. A caught lie, unspent, was worth more than a lie confronted too soon.
10:49. "Any word on Marcus?" Wendell asked, and the desperation in it was real enough. Bumpy no longer doubted that part, whatever else remained uncertain. "Nothing new. The deadline's in 1 hour and 10 minutes. I know what time it is." Wendell's composure cracked at the edges. "Then what are we doing? We should be finding Rourke, finishing this, sending the proof they asked for. We're not killing Rourke." "Then what, Bumpy? What's the plan? Because I don't see one. I just see you disappearing for hours at a time while my son—" 10:57. "Sit down." Wendell sat, more from habit than obedience. "I have a plan. It doesn't involve a dead doctor. It involves a photograph that looks like one." Wendell blinked, the anger draining into something more careful. Staged. "Rourke's agreed, if it comes to that, to help us buy the time we need. A photograph can lie as easily as a certificate can. We use that against the people who taught us it was possible." "And if they check?" "If they want more than a photograph?" "Then we're back where we started, with less time. But it's the only path that doesn't end with an old man's blood on my hands for nothing." 11:06. Rourke, brought quietly to a back room above a barber shop on Lenox that Bumpy sometimes used for business too delicate for an office, agreed to the plan with a steadiness that surprised even him. "I've been afraid of dying for 9 days, he said, lying back against a stack of towels while Percy arranged red dye and a borrowed camera. "Pretending to be dead, at least, gives the fear somewhere useful to go." "Hold still. I've held still for worse indignities than this in my years of practice, Mr. Johnson. Trust me on that." 11:14. The staging took longer than Bumpy would have liked. The angle of the light, the placement of the wound, the particular slackness a body takes when the person inside it has actually stopped being a person, which a living man, however willing, could only approximate so well. Percy took a dozen photographs before one looked convincing enough to risk a boy's life on. Bumpy studied the chosen print a long time. It was good. It was also, he thought, the kind of thing a man shouldn't get good at making, however useful the skill turned out to be today. "How do we deliver it?" Percy asked. "We don't have a way to reach them directly. Every message so far has come to us." That was true, and it had bothered Bumpy since the second envelope arrived.
a one-way channel, messages sent, but never a way to send one back. They'll come to us again before noon. They have to. A deadline needs a place to collect its proof. He was right, though he wouldn't feel good about being right until the knock actually came, 20 minutes later, delivered by a boy no older than 12 who ran the moment the envelope changed hands. Inside, a single line of instruction, same chipped E typewriter, same cold economy of words. Leave the proof at the newsstand on 145th, noon.
Do not follow whoever collects it. Bumpy read it twice, the way he'd read everything that mattered tonight, and then looked at the staged photograph sitting on the table between them, suddenly smaller and less certain than it had felt an hour ago. "That's Otis's stand," Percy said. "He'll see who takes it." "He'll see. He won't follow. That's the instruction, and we're going to honor it, because a boy's life is riding on somebody keeping their word today, even if it isn't the people who took him." 11:58. Otis agreed without hesitation when Bumpy explained what was needed, the old newsstand owner's face settling into the particular grim patience of a man who understood, better than most, what Harlem sometimes asked of the people who loved it. "I'll see the face. I won't chase it. That's all I need. And if it's a face I know..."
Bumpy hadn't considered that possibility, and the thought of it, a familiar face collecting proof of a murder that hadn't happened, sat uneasily in his chest as the envelope was placed at 11:59 exactly where instructed, 1 minute before the deadline arrived. 12 o'clock noon found Harlem exactly as ordinary as it always was at that hour. Lunch carts opening, women walking home with groceries, a trolley bell somewhere 2 streets over. Bumpy watched from a doorway 30 yards down, close enough to see, far enough to honor the instruction that mattered more today than any instruction had mattered in years. A man in a gray coat, unremarkable, hat low, walked past the newsstand without slowing, lifted the envelope in a motion so practiced it barely registered as a motion at all, and kept walking. Gone before Bumpy's eyes had fully adjusted to tracking him. 12:04. Otis caught Bumpy's eye from behind the stand and shook his head, slow, meaning, "Not a face I know."
That should have been a relief. Instead, Bumpy felt the first genuine cold of the entire night settle into his chest. Because a stranger, professional enough to collect proof of murder without breaking stride, was not the kind of man who worked for grievance or passion. He was the kind of man who worked for money, competently, for someone who had hired competence specifically because competence left no room for the kind of mistakes amateurs made. "Now what?" Percy asked, once they'd regrouped 2 blocks away, out of sight of the stand. "Now we wait, and we hope the photograph was good enough, and we keep looking, because a proof accepted doesn't mean a promise kept." He didn't say the rest of it, that every instinct trained into him over decades told him a deadline met rarely produced the reward it promised, that men careful enough to move a hostage between locations overnight were rarely careless enough to simply let a boy walk home the moment their demand was satisfied. Wendell would hear that fear soon enough, without Bumpy adding to it early. 12:26. Wendell was waiting at the office, having been kept from the delivery itself for reasons of safety neither man had needed to explain twice. "Well?" "Delivered, collected, no trouble." "Then when does he come home?" Bumpy didn't have an answer, and the not having of it filled the room the way smoke fills a space too small to hold it. "I don't know." "You don't know," Wendell repeated, voice climbing. "We did what they asked. He's supposed to come home. They didn't say when, only that the boy doesn't come home if we don't. That's not the same promise you're hearing." 12:41.
The waiting that followed was its own particular kind of torment. No clock to watch now, no deadline to race, only silence stretching in every direction with nothing to fill it but the small, ordinary sounds of an office trying to pretend it was still a place where normal business happened. Isaiah brought food nobody ate.
Percy checked his watch every few minutes, out of habit more than usefulness.
Wendell sat by the window, watching the street the way a man watches for a bus he's afraid has already come and gone without him. 3 hours in, the phone finally rang, and every man in the room went still enough that the ring itself seemed unreasonably loud. Bumpy answered. No voice on the other end, only the sound of breathing, patient, unhurried, and then, faintly, in the background, a boy's voice, muffled, saying something too indistinct to make out except for the shape of a single word that might have been "Dad." Then the line went dead. Wendell was on his feet before Bumpy had even lowered the receiver, face white, hands shaking in a way that had nothing left to do with performance. That was him. That was Marcus. I know. They're taunting us. Why would they call and not talk?
Bumpy set the phone down carefully, the way a man sets down something that might still be dangerous even after the immediate threat is past. Because a call like that isn't a message. It's a proof of their own. Proof he's alive. Proof they still hold him. Proof the deadline being met bought us information, not release. It was, he understood even as he said it, a very small mercy, dressed up as something crueler than it needed to be. 1335. Ruth Day arrived not long after, having heard through channels of her own that something had shifted, her face carrying the particular weight of a woman who'd learned something and wasn't certain yet how much of it she wanted to say out loud in a room this full of grief. "Walk with me," she said to Bumpy, and he followed her out to the hallway, away from Wendell's hearing. What? The man who collected the envelope. Otis got a better look than he let on in front of the boy's father. Recognized the coat, if not the face. Whose coat? 1344. A driver, Ruth said. Works, on and off, for a man who runs freight out of a warehouse on the west side. Not Russo's people. Different operation entirely. Moves goods for whoever pays. No loyalty to any one boss in particular. A name for the man who runs it. Kessler, she said, and then, seeing Bumpy's face, corrected herself quickly. No, not your Kessler. Different man. Victor Kessler. No relation. Coincidence of a name. Nothing more. Two Kesslers in one day felt, to Bumpy, like exactly the kind of coincidence that wasn't one, though he couldn't yet say why. 1353. You're certain it's the same man? Otis is certain about the coat. The coat doesn't prove the man, but it's a place to start that isn't a dead end, which is more than we had an hour ago. Bumpy thanked her the way he'd thanked Otis, with more than the information technically required, and turned the new name over in his mind the way he'd turned over every name that night, testing its weight, its shape, whether it fit anywhere in the picture slowly, painfully assembling itself out of scars and rings and accounts and accents that didn't belong to Harlem. 1407. He sent Isaiah to the West Side warehouse with instructions to watch, not approach, a lesson learned the hard way after Russo's ice house had cost them hours chasing a man who, whatever else he was, hadn't been holding a child. This time, Bumpy wanted eyes before action, patience before pride. Wendell wanted to go himself, and Bumpy refused him flatly, the refusal landing harder than intended in a room already raw with exhaustion. You're too close to this. A father at that warehouse gets people hurt faster than a stranger does. Wendell didn't argue, which told Bumpy something too, though he couldn't yet say what. 1423. While they waited on Isaiah's report, Bumpy returned,
alone this time, to the question that had been sitting unaddressed since morning. The apartment on 128th Street, rented under Wendell's initials 2 years after Corinne's death, for a shell company neither of them had ever discussed. He hadn't confronted Wendell with it directly yet. Some questions needed the right room, the right hour, and a boy's location still unknown was neither. But the fact sat in his coat pocket now, folded like the note itself, waiting for the moment it would matter more than patience did. 1441. Isaiah's report came back within the hour, delivered in the clipped, careful language of a man reporting only what he'd actually seen and none of what he'd guessed. Warehouse is active, legitimate-looking traffic, crates, a couple of trucks. But there's a back office, lights on all afternoon, curtains drawn tight enough that somebody's being careful about who sees in. Any sign of the boy? No, but there's a side door, guarded, that doesn't match the rest of the operation. Regular warehouse men don't guard a door that only leads to a stairwell. A stairwell led somewhere. That was, finally, a shape worth following. 1502. Bumpy assembled a small team, Percy, Isaiah, 2 others whose discretion he trusted more than their size, and laid out the plan on the same delivery manifest he'd used at 2 a.m. to sketch the night's first shapeless suspicions, now filling in with lines that finally connected to something. We watch until dark. We don't move on the warehouse until we're certain the boy's actually inside. A wrong guess now costs more than time. Wendell, allowed to listen this time but not to join, sat with his hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone the color of the certificate Kessler had examined that morning. 1524. There's something else, Bumpy said before the team dispersed, choosing the moment carefully, watching Wendell's face as he spoke. The mail drop for Larkspur Holdings, rented under the name W. Grant in a building 2 blocks from your apartment, 2 years ago. The room went very still. Wendell's face did several things at once. Surprise, then something that looked like calculation, then, finally, something closer to defeat. I can explain that. Then explain it. Now. Before we walk into a warehouse for your son with half the truth still sitting in your pocket. It's not what you think, Wendell said, voice low, urgent, aware suddenly of every eye in the room. I set up Larkspur 2 years ago to move money. My money, not yours, never yours, because I was scared. Scared of what? Of someone asking about Corinne's estate. There were questions after she died from her family down south about money that should have gone to her sister and didn't. I moved it, hid it, told myself it was temporary. Money that should have gone to her sister. Because I'd already spent most of it. Before she died. That's the theft Corinne found, Bumpy. Not 12,000, closer to 40. 1541. The number landed heavier than any accusation had all day. You lied about the amount this morning. I was ashamed. I am ashamed. But I did not kill her, and I did not hire anyone to take my son. And every hour you spend suspecting me instead of finding him is an hour we don't have. It might have been true. It might have been the most convenient lie a desperate man could construct, built exactly to redirect suspicion toward guilt small enough to survive, and away from guilt large enough to hang him. Bumpy couldn't yet tell which, and the not knowing cost him more than the lie itself did. 1552. We finished the warehouse first, Bumpy said finally, standing, ending the conversation the only way that mattered right now. Whatever you did or didn't do 8 years ago waits until Marcus is safe. I gave you my word on that this morning. I'm not taking it back now. Whatever you've just told me. Wendell nodded, something between gratitude and terror crossing his face in equal measure. Percy caught Bumpy's eye from across the room, a question in it that didn't need voicing. Do you believe him? Bumpy didn't answer that question, even silently, even to himself. 15. The team took positions around the warehouse as afternoon slid toward evening, the kind of patient, invisible watching that took more discipline than any raid, hours of nothing, punctuated by small, meaningless movements that might, eventually, mean everything. A truck arrived at 1640, unloaded crates that looked exactly like every other crate that had come through that day. A man smoked a cigarette by the side door at 1703, glanced up and down the street with the practiced carelessness of someone who'd been told to look casual and had never quite learned how. Nothing yet that confirmed a boy's presence.
1726.
At 1726, the side door opened, and a man Bumpy recognized immediately, even from a distance, even after 8 years, stepped out into the alley to speak quietly with the guard, a man with a scar near his ear, the streetlight catching a heavy gold ring as he gestured while he talked. Percy, the side Bumpy in the doorway across the street, went rigid. "That's him. That's the one from the corner." Bumpy said nothing, watching, memorizing the shape of a man who had, until that exact moment, existed only as a description assembled from a nervous newsstand owner's memory. 1738. The scarred man finished his conversation and disappeared back through the side door, and Bumpy understood, with the particular cold clarity that comes only after hours of uncertainty finally resolving into fact, that the stairwell behind that door led somewhere that mattered. "We move at dark," he told the team, quiet, final. "Full positions. Nobody goes in until I say, and nobody says a word to Wendell until the boy's actually in the car." Isaiah nodded. Percy didn't. Not right away. His eyes still fixed on the door the scarred man had vanished through, as if watching hard enough might make it open again sooner. 1752. Bumpy stepped back from the doorway, breathing out slow, running the whole of the day one more time through his mind the way he'd run it a dozen times already. Rousseau's fear, real but wrong. Rourke's guilt, real but insufficient. Wendell's lies, plural now, each one smaller than the last, but adding up to a weight that troubled him more than any single one alone. Understanding always comes late. That's why it's expensive. He hoped, standing in a doorway across from a warehouse, holding a boy he'd known since infancy, that the bill hadn't already come due.
1809. Dusk settled over the west side the way it settled everywhere in the city. Gradually, then all at once. Streetlights flickering on in a ragged wave up and down the block. The warehouse's activity slowing as legitimate business gave way to whatever business actually happened there after dark. Bumpy checked his watch. 20 minutes until the position he'd set for the team to move. 20 minutes that felt, after a day already stretched thin by hours that refused to move at any reasonable pace, like the longest 20 minutes the whole ordeal had yet demanded of him. 1831. At exactly the moment the team began to shift into position, a black sedan pulled up outside the warehouse's main gate. Not a truck, not a delivery, a car built for a man who wanted to be noticed arriving and not noticed doing anything else. A driver stepped out first, opened the rear door, and a second man emerged, unhurried, expensive coat, the particular stillness of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence. Bumpy didn't recognize him. That, in itself, after a full day and night of recognizing almost everyone who mattered, felt like the most dangerous fact of the entire investigation so far. 1847. The unfamiliar man disappeared through the warehouse's front entrance, not the side door, moving with the ease of someone who owned the building rather than merely worked in it. "Who is that?" Percy whispered. "I don't know,"
And not knowing, tonight, is the worst thing anyone's told me since the envelope hit Wendell's table. He turned to Isaiah. Get a photograph if you can. Distance is fine. I need a face to put a name to before we move on that building.
Isaiah slipped away into the growing dark, and Bumpy stood watching the warehouse's front door the way a man watches a door he suspects hides an answer he isn't ready for. 1915, Isaiah returned within the half hour, a small camera tucked back into his coat, expression unreadable in the dim streetlight. Got him coming back out. Clear shot. Develop it tonight. I want a face by morning, sooner if we can manage it. There's something else, Isaiah said, hesitating in a way that wasn't like him. When he came out, the scarred one walked him to the car, called him something. Sounded like, sir, maybe more than that. Sounded almost like a name I couldn't quite catch. Try. Isaiah shook his head slowly. Couldn't be sure. Sounded like it started with a G. 1922. A name starting with G sat in Bumpy's chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples of it reaching outward toward possibilities he didn't yet want to name even to himself. Grant.
It was too easy, too obvious. The kind of thread a careless man might plant precisely because he expected it to be dismissed as too convenient to be true. Or it was exactly what it sounded like, and the entire night's careful investigation had been circling, blind, around a truth that had been standing in the room with them since the very first envelope hit the table. 1940. He didn't share the fragment with the team yet, not until Isaiah's photograph could confirm or deny what a half-heard syllable in bad light could never prove on its own. Instead, he refocused the operation on the immediate, achievable goal: the stairwell, the side door, the boy who might right now be sitting somewhere above their heads counting hours the way his father had spent the whole day counting them downstairs in an office 3 miles away. Positions, Bumpy said, and the word moved through the small team like a current finally allowed to run.
2003. The side door's guard changed shifts at 2003. A small window of confusion Bumpy's team had been counting on since the first hour of watching. The outgoing guard distracted by handing off details, the incoming guard still adjusting to a post he hadn't held in hours. Percy moved first, fast, low, the particular economy of motion that came from a man who'd spent his whole life training his body to do exactly what was needed and nothing more. The guard went down quiet, more surprised than hurt, and the door, unlocked in the confusion, opened onto a stairwell exactly where Isaiah had said it would be. 2011. Bumpy went up first, Percy behind him, Isaiah covering the door, each step measured, deliberate, a man climbing not toward danger exactly, but toward an answer he'd spent 18 hours assembling out of fragments and fear. The stairwell smelled of dust and machine oil, the particular smell of a building that did honest work on its lower floors, and something else entirely above them. At the top, a single door, unmarked, light showing faintly beneath it. Bumpy paused, hand on the frame, and listened. Somewhere behind that door, faint but unmistakable, a boy's voice. And beneath it, another voice, calm, patient, speaking too low to make out the words. 2019. Bumpy pushed the door open slow, weapon low but ready. Percy a half step behind him, covering the angle he couldn't. The room inside was small, spare, a single lamp burning over a folding cot where Marcus Grant sat, wrists bound but otherwise unhurt, eyes going wide with a relief so total it looked, for a moment, like it might undo him entirely. Standing beside the cot, unhurried, unsurprised, hands empty and raised without being asked,
stood a man Bumpy had never seen before in his life. The same man from the sedan, the expensive coat, the stillness of someone who'd expected this exact moment for longer than tonight. "Mr. Johnson," the man said, voice calm, almost pleasant, the voice of someone entirely unbothered by the gun leveled at his chest. "I've been wondering when you'd finally get here. Who are you?" "A question," the man said, smiling faintly. "You should have been asking your right hand a great deal sooner than tonight." Behind Bumpy, Percy was already moving toward Marcus, cutting the ropes at his wrists, the boy's breath coming in short, relieved gasps that filled the small room with a sound more human than anything else that had happened all day. The man in the expensive coat didn't move at all. 2027. "You should have been asking your right hand a great deal sooner than tonight." Bumpy didn't lower the gun. "Your name?" "Victor Kessler. Not the one who reads signatures for a living. A different kind of accountant." He smiled, faint, unbothered by the barrel 6 feet from his chest. "I settle things people can't settle themselves." Percy had Marcus's ropes cut by now, the boy's arms shaking as blood found its way back into his hands. "Take him down," Bumpy said, not looking away from Kessler. "Now." Percy moved. Kessler watched him go with the mild interest of a man watching weather change. 2034. "You're not fighting this," Bumpy said. "Fighting was never the job. I deliver. I collect. Tonight the collection's finished." Kessler's hands stayed raised, easy, almost bored. "Whether you shoot me or not changes very little about what happens next." "What happens next?" "That's not mine to say. I was hired for a task, Mr. Johnson. The task is complete. My employer's instructions after that point were never my concern." "Your employer?" Kessler's smile widened a fraction. "You already know his name. You've known it longer than you've wanted to." 2041. Isaiah bound Kessler's wrists with the same rope that had held the boy an hour before, a small, deliberate cruelty nobody commented on. "Talk," Bumpy said. "Everything, or I stop being a man who asks politely." "You've been polite all night. It's why you're still 3 steps behind." Bumpy crouched to Kessler's eye level, voice dropping low enough that only the two of them could hear it. "I've got a boy safe downstairs, and nothing left to lose tonight but patience. Don't test what's under it." Something in Kessler's face shifted then, not fear exactly, but recognition of a man who meant it. 2049. "Wendell Grant hired me 19 days ago, Kessler said. "Cash, through a man I trust, for a job he described as insurance. Grab a boy, hold him clean, no marks, release him the moment proof arrived." "Proof of what?" "A death, whichever death he named in the letter." Kessler tilted his head. He was very specific. It had to be your hand, not a hired man's, yours. The floor seemed to tilt very slightly under that sentence. "Why?" "Ask him. That part he never explained to a man he was only paying to carry boxes." 2057. 19 days, Bumpy repeated, doing the arithmetic even as his voice stayed flat. "Before Rourke wrote his letter." "Before the letter existed at all, as far as I understood it." Kessler shrugged inside the ropes. "Your bookkeeper knew what was coming before the doctor did. That should tell you something about who was really afraid in this whole arrangement." Percy came back up the stairs, having settled Marcus in the car with Isaiah's second man standing guard. "He's safe. Shaking, but safe." Bumpy didn't answer.
He was still looking at Kessler, watching a shape finish assembling itself in the worst possible light.
2106. The photograph, Bumpy said. Staged. You collected it at noon. Why not release him then, if the proof was all that mattered? For the first time, something like genuine hesitation crossed Kessler's face. That wasn't my call to make either. My men held him past the deadline on new instruction. Not from Grant, from further up my own ladder. Meaning? Meaning a job that started as insurance became a liability the moment we understood whose son we were holding. Bumpy Johnson's right-hand's boy isn't a quiet problem. My people don't like loud problems walking around after the fact. 2114. The sentence landed harder than any threat all night, because it wasn't a threat. It was an explanation, delivered flatly, by a man discussing inventory. They were going to kill him, even with the proof delivered. Was, Kessler said. Past tense now, since you've got him in a car downstairs instead of where my men intended him to be by morning. Bumpy stood, the cold that had been building in his chest all night finally settling into something he could use instead of something that used him. Where's Grant now? Home, I'd guess. Waiting for a boy who was never coming back to him regardless of what he sent you to do. 2123. They left Kessler for the men Bumpy trusted to hold him quietly until morning, and drove hard toward Wendell's apartment with Marcus wrapped in a coat in the back seat, silent, staring at nothing, the particular silence of a boy who had spent a night learning things about the world no 17-year-old should learn in one sitting. Is my dad? Marcus started, then stopped, unable to finish a sentence he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Your father's alive, Bumpy said. Everything else we're about to find out together. It wasn't comfort. It was the truth, which was, tonight, the only thing Bumpy had left to offer anyone. 2138. Wendell's apartment was empty, not ransacked, emptied, deliberately. A coat missing from its hook, a small case gone from beside the bed. The particular tidiness of a man who had packed only what mattered and left the rest as evidence of a life he no longer intended to return to. On the kitchen table, one line, handwritten this time, no chipped E typewriter, just Wendell's own careful accountant's hand. I have to finish this myself. Tell Marcus I'm sorry. Tell Bumpy the ledger's in the floor safe. Bumpy read it twice, understanding arriving, as it always did tonight, a beat too late to be useful. 2144. Finish what? Percy said, reading over his shoulder. Bumpy already knew. A man whose entire plan had collapsed. A doctor still breathing. A son rescued out of his control. A hired crew who'd nearly killed the one thing he'd claimed to be protecting. Had exactly one loose end left standing between himself and total ruin. Rourke. Alive. Talking, eventually, to someone with the authority to make the truth matter. He's going to Rourke's to finish what the kidnapping was supposed to make me do. You think he'd actually... I think a man who's lost everything else tonight has nothing left to lose by trying. 2151. Marcus, still in the back seat, caught the last of it. Understanding arriving on his face in stages. First, confusion. Then disbelief. Then something that broke and hardened at the same time. My dad wouldn't hurt anyone. Nobody answered him. Bumpy pulled away from the curb faster than the street technically allowed. Percy beside him, checking the chamber of a gun he hoped, genuinely, not to need again tonight. Isaiah, Bumpy said into the radio.
132nd Street, Rourke's practice. Move. The city outside blurred past in the particular gray of very early morning, the hour when Harlem belonged, briefly, only to the people awake enough to still be running from something. 2203 Rourke's practice was dark when they arrived, same as it had been at midnight the night before, except this time the door stood open a crack, unlocked, unattended. Bumpy went in first, weapon low, the smell of antiseptic and old paper exactly as it had been hours earlier, except now, underneath it, faint, something else. Fear, recent, still hanging in a room that hadn't finished absorbing it. "Rourke!" No answer. Files lay scattered across the floor near the locked drawer, the lock broken, forced, the drawer itself hanging open and empty. 2211. A sound from the back room, a chair scraping, a voice, low, pleading, another voice answering it flat and exhausted in a register Bumpy recognized immediately. He moved toward it fast, Percy a half step behind, and found Wendell standing over Rourke, who sat pressed against the wall behind his own desk, hands raised, a letter opener. The only weapon within reach of a man who spent his days healing people, not hurting them, held loose and shaking in Wendell's own grip. Wendell. Wendell didn't turn around. "Stay back, Bumpy. This isn't yours to fix." "It's exactly mine to fix," Bumpy said, stepping into the room slowly, hands visible, the way a man approaches something wounded and unpredictable. "You made it mine the moment you put my hand on that note. I didn't have a choice. Everybody in this room tonight has said that sentence to me at least once. It's never once been true." Rourke, pressed against the wall, found Bumpy's eyes and held them, silent, understanding that the wrong word from him right now might be the last word he ever spoke. "Put it down," Bumpy said. "Whatever's left to lose, dropping that doesn't cost you any of it." 2224. "He was going to talk," Wendell said, voice cracking. 9 days. I had 9 days to figure out how to stop a letter that would end everything. The money, the company, 20 years of you trusting me. And I couldn't think of anything except making it look like someone else's problem. So you took your own son. I told them not to hurt him. I told them the whole point was that nobody got hurt, that you'd kill Rourke and I'd have you tied to it forever, and none of it would ever come back to Corinne or me or the money. Or Corinne's death. 2231. The letter opener trembled harder in Wendell's hand. I didn't kill her. Then who did? Nobody killed her. She had a weak heart, and she found out I'd stolen from the man who trusted me with everything, and the shame of what I'd done to her killed her faster than any heart condition ever could have on its own. His voice broke entirely on the last words, the letter opener slipping, forgotten, from fingers that no longer had the strength to hold anything. Rourke, still pressed against the wall, exhaled for what looked like the first time in several minutes. 2239. Bumpy closed the last few feet between them and took the letter opener from the floor before Wendell's hand remembered it was empty. Sit down. Wendell sat, the same way he'd sat in his own kitchen 29 hours earlier, obedience arriving now not from respect, but from a body with nothing left to fight with. The plan, Bumpy said. All of it. From the beginning. I want to hear the whole shape before I decide what happens to you. You already know the shape. I know pieces. I want the whole picture, Wendell. You owe every person in this room that much at minimum. So Wendell told it. The theft, small at first, and then not small at all, spread across 3 years while Corinne's trust in him grew instead of shrinking. Her discovery of it 2 weeks before her death. Her visit to Rourke, frightened, uncertain who else to trust. Her death, sudden, genuinely a failing heart, though Wendell admitted now what he'd denied all night.
that he'd let the funeral move fast, let the casket stay closed, not from grief alone, but from a terror that any closer look might reveal how thin his own alibi for that final week actually was. "I didn't kill her," he said again, quieter now, "but I let everyone believe whatever kept the questions away. That's its own kind of guilt. I know that now." And Larkspur. Insurance, the same as everything else I've built these past 2 years.
A place to move what was left of the stolen money before anyone came looking, in case her family ever pushed harder than they did. And 9 days ago, Rourke's nurse, she's my second cousin Bumpy. Small world, smaller than either of us knew until she mentioned, in passing, over dinner, that her employer had written something troubling and hadn't yet found the courage to send it. Wendell's laugh had no humor in it at all. I built an entire plan around a letter that hadn't even left the building. I destroyed everything chasing a ghost that was still deciding whether to exist. 2304. Rourke spoke for the first time since Bumpy had entered the room, voice thin but steady. "I would have sent it eventually. You should know that. Whatever comfort there is in almost, I was always going to finish what I started." Wendell nodded, not arguing, past the point of arguing anything. "I know. I think some part of me always knew.
I just wanted one more year of not being the man the letter would have made me." "You're that man regardless," Bumpy said. "The letter never had to exist for that to be true." 2315. Percy, standing near the door, finally broke the silence that had settled over the room. "What do we do with him?" It was the question Bumpy had been turning over since the note landed on Wendell's own kitchen table 29 hours earlier, and he found, now that the moment for an answer had actually arrived, that the easy versions of justice, a bullet, a body in the river, the kind of ending Harlem understood and rarely questioned, held no appeal at all. A dead Wendell taught Marcus nothing except that his father had been right to be afraid of the world he'd built. 2324. "You're not going to prison," Bumpy said. "The theft, the shell company, none of that survives a courtroom without dragging things out that hurt more people than it punishes. Corinne's family, Marcus,
Every man who's ever trusted me because I said I'd handle problems quietly." "Then what?" "You leave. Tonight. Before Marcus wakes up enough to ask you questions you don't deserve the chance to answer face to face. No money beyond what gets you somewhere far from here. No name that connects you to me, or to Harlem, ever again. And Marcus stays. With people who love him honestly. That's the one mercy in this you don't get to argue with." 2333. Wendell absorbed that the way a man absorbs a sentence he knows, somewhere underneath the pain of it, is more generous than he has any right to expect. "Can I say goodbye to him?" Bumpy considered it a long moment. "You can write to him. Not tonight. Not for a long while. When he's old enough to decide for himself whether he wants to read it." It wasn't kindness exactly. It was the version of consequence Bumpy had decided, standing in a doctor's ransacked office at nearly midnight on a night that refused to end, actually served the boy better than either forgiveness or blood. 2341 Rourke, still gathering himself against the wall, looked at Bumpy with something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite grief either. 9 days I carried that letter, afraid of exactly this room, this moment. I never once imagined it would end with the man I was protecting sitting across from me broken, instead of me being the one who ended up broken. "Understanding always comes late," Bumpy said. "That's why it's expensive. You paid early. That's the only mercy either of us gets tonight." Rourke almost smiled at that, tired, real.
I've been paying for 8 years, Mr. Johnson. Tonight just finally presented the bill.
2352. Isaiah arrived at the practice not long after, having secured Kessler properly and left 2 men to hold him until morning brought decisions that belonged to daylight instead of exhaustion.
Marcus is asking for his father. Bumpy looked at Wendell, who had gone very still at the sentence, the reality of the next several minutes arriving all at once after a night spent avoiding it in every possible direction. 5 minutes, Bumpy said. In the car. Percy stays close enough to hear every word. That's not much time to say what needs saying. It's more than most fathers get to fix 20 years of mistakes in. Use it. 0007. The 5 minutes, when they came, were quiet in a way nothing else that night had been. No note, no clock, no stranger's voice on the other end of a telephone line, just a father and a son in the backseat of a car parked on a dark street, saying the kind of things that don't survive being repeated afterward by anyone who overheard them.
Marcus came out of the car with his face wet and his jaw set in a way that looked, for the first time all night, genuinely like his father's. Not the liar, but the man underneath, who'd loved something enough to destroy himself trying to protect it badly. Wendell didn't look back once he started walking. 019 Percy drove Marcus home, not to the empty apartment on 132nd, but to Bumpy's own house, where Mame was already awake, already had a bed made up before anyone asked her to. Because some women understood, without needing the details explained, exactly what a night like this required by morning. Bumpy stayed behind at the office with Isaiah, going through what remained. Kessler's confession, formal now, written and witnessed. The floor safe at Wendell's apartment, opened to reveal a ledger that documented, in Wendell's own careful hand, every dollar he'd ever moved and every lie he'd ever told to cover it.
038. The ledger told a story more honest than anything Wendell had managed to say out loud all night. Years of small thefts, meticulously tracked even as they were hidden. Interest calculated on money he'd stolen, as though some part of him had always intended, eventually, to pay it all back in full. He never had. But the accounting was real, careful, the work of a man who understood numbers well enough to know exactly how far he'd fallen and precisely how much it would someday cost him to climb back out, even as he kept digging the hole deeper year after year. 051. Bumpy closed the ledger and sat with it a long while in the quiet office, the same desk where the whole night had started with a boy's schedule and a pencil behind an ear. 20 years of trust, and he hadn't seen any of it. Not the theft, not the fear, not the particular kind of desperation that turns a careful man into someone willing to sacrifice his own son's safety to protect a lie. That failure sat heavier than the night's exhaustion. A man who prided himself on reading rooms had spent 2 decades standing in the same room as this and reading none of it correctly. 109 Isaiah found him there near dawn, the second morning of the ordeal arriving with none of the drama of the first. Just gray light and tired men and a city that had, as always, gone on entirely unaware of what it had cost several people to keep it that way. You did right by the boy. I did the least wrong thing available. There's a difference, and most nights I'd rather not know it as clearly as I know it now. Kessler's crew, the ones who wanted the boy gone regardless, what happens to them? They learn, eventually, that Harlem remembers men who make that kind of decision about a child. That lesson doesn't need my hand to arrive. 124, Ruth Day came by not long after, having heard enough through the night's scattered channels to understand the shape of it without needing every detail spelled out.
"Rourke," she said. "He's shaken but whole. Wants to know if he's still welcome in this neighborhood, after everything." "Tell him yes.
Tell him the letter he never sent did more good unsent than most letters managed sent. 9 days of silence bought a boy's life, even if none of us understood that's what it was buying at the time. Ruth nodded, filing that away the way she filed everything, quietly, permanently, useful again someday. 1:47, Percy returned from Bumpy's house with word that Marcus had finally slept, exhausted past the point where fear could keep him upright any longer. Mame sitting in a chair beside the bed the way she'd once sat beside her own children's beds through fevers and nightmares neither of them could name. "He asked me something," Percy said, "before he went under. Asked if it was his fault
For not looking harder at the car outside the gym."
"What'd you tell him?" "Told him the only man responsible for tonight is the one who built it. Told him watching a corner doesn't stop a father from making the choices a father makes." Good answer. 2:15. Bumpy drove to the river alone before the sun fully cleared the buildings, the same stretch of water where he'd stood 20 hours earlier trying to make sense of an empty storage unit and a cot's 4 faint indentations in the dust. The water looked the same as it always looked, indifferent, patient, entirely unbothered by whatever the city built and broke along its banks. He thought about the note's first line, the one that had started all of it. "Kill the man in this photograph, by your own hand." Wendell had wanted a murderer, not a solution. He'd gotten neither in the end, only a truth too heavy to carry any further alone. 2:38. Understanding always comes late. That's why it's expensive. He'd paid for this one in a currency that didn't show up on any ledger Wendell had ever kept. 20 years of trust spent in a single night on a man who'd never deserved the full weight of it, though neither had Bumpy known that until the weight was already gone. The sun came up properly around 6 o'clock, same as it always did, indifferent to what the night had cost, and Harlem began again the way it always began, waking into a Tuesday that most of its residents would never know had nearly cost a father his son, and a city one more quiet, careful lie it could no longer afford to keep.
6:30. 3 days later, Marcus went back to the gym, Percy waiting in the doorway the way he always waited, watching the boy wrap his hands with the same careful patience his father had once taught him, before any of them had known what that word, father, was about to cost. "Left up," Percy said. Marcus managed something close to a smile, thin but real. "You sound like my old man." Percy didn't correct him. Some sentences, even the complicated ones, deserved to stay simple a little while longer, at least until a boy was ready to carry the whole truth the way the rest of them already had to.